Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 8 on the Free Motion Quilting Project. This week I want to return to that very big, large-scale stippling that we were doing a couple weeks ago. That's like between a half and a 1-inch scale. It's the distance between the lines of quilting. I want to return to that because that's really going to be the best scale to stitch bed quilts or throws, that kind of thing that you're going to wash a lot, that you're going to drag around, that are going to be used and you really want to be soft and comfortable. What I've been thinking about is really how to quilt on a real quilt, how to deal with not only bright and complex fabric patterns, but also all those seam lines, all of those things that happen with a real quilt that might not happen with our practice quilts or cheater cloth quilts. Another thing is when you match thread, you can't really see where you've been or where you're going, and that's a challenge too. So let's work on all of these different aspects and get some tips on quilting real quilts with larger scale stippling. So the first thing we're going to do is just get started in the middle of the quilt, and you can see where I started stitching was right on a seam line, and that's a great place to kind of hide your start. A lot of people have been worried about having a noticeable start line to their stippling, and so long as you start in a seam, kind of in the ditch somewhere, it's not going to be that noticeable. And you can see how crazy and wild these fabrics are. They're really kind of tricky to see your quilting line as you're stitching. And the best thing for that is simply to maintain a good focus. As soon as you start feeling tired and frustrated by not being able to see your thread, it's a good time to stop and take a break. You can see here that I am contrasting thread. This is a dark purple thread. And it's a contrast definitely over this orange and yellow fabric, but in certain other areas of the quilt it does match. And I chose it because it just added a nice kind of bright element to the quilt. And this is the thread color I would have chosen whether I was quilting this on video or not. So this is an accurate color for what I'm doing with this quilt. Now I've cut here so that way you can see how careful I am with the seam lines. This is a crazy quilt, so there's a lot of different seam lines going in all different directions. And whenever I'm dealing with that, I'm just trying to press that seam line down so that way I can stitch over it smoothly and it's not forming pleats. I'll be honest, this quilt was pieced more than 4 years ago, and I didn't do the best job on it. So there are a lot of baggy areas. One area in particular did have some pleats result simply because the pieces weren't securely pieced together, and that's just going to be something you deal with. We're all in a kind of a learning phase when it comes to quilting our quilts, and some issues will quilt out and some won't, and that's just something to kind of apply to your piecing ability as well. When you see something that didn't quite work, that might be something to look back at with your piecing and see if you can make that improvement there and have that translate into your finished quilts in the quilting process. And one big thing is to keep in mind is you're going to have areas where all 4 seams butt up, like that area right there where 2 orange blocks, a green block, and a purple block all kind of butt up together. And rather than trying to stitch over that with a nice curvy stippling, it's a better idea just to stitch up to it, stitch around it, but don't try and stitch over it because it can be real hard to make a nice curve and keep and maintain that nice wiggly stippling when you're stitching over something that can be that big and bulky. Here you can see I've zoomed in so that way you can see how I'm stitching when I'm matching thread to the fabric color. And of course I can't really see what I'm doing. It's much more challenging to be able to see what's happening. And so sometimes I'm leaving gaps, I'm leaving open spaces on the quilt just simply because I can't really see the thread, the former place where I stitched before. And the better thing I've found with this is to leave space open rather than try and get too close to your previous line of stitching. When you come too close or you cross your threads, that's noticeable. It's far more noticeable than maybe just an empty open space. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. whatever you do, don't worry about it too much. If you hit your thread or you come too close, don't worry about it and don't pick it out. That's a waste of your time and energy, and really, honestly, no one's going to notice that kind of mistake. Now, a lot of people have asked about what happens when you run out of bobbin thread when you're stitching stippling. Stippling is such a curvy, wiggly design, and there's no real good place to stop and have a broken thread. So your starts and stops are also quite noticeable. So here you can see I'm actually picking out the thread. The bobbin thread ran out. I didn't leave a very long tail, so I used my cheater needle to just kind of pick that bobbin thread out just a bit. And then I tie a knot. My hand's in the way, but you can see I'm just tying a knot. That's going to keep those two threads together and lock them together. Then I'm just inserting a cheater needle into the middle layer of the quilt, and then going to pop those two threads in the end of the cheater needle, so that way they're going to go into the middle layer of the quilt and hide. And of course sometimes one of the threads will pop off, and that's no big deal. Just go ahead and insert the needle again, pop it in and pull it through, and make sure that that knot, of course, popped into the middle layer of that quilt. I'm going to cut off the thread tails, and of course I had to insert my bobbin, and here I go. I'm going to drop the needle into that line, and I'm going to just drop it down and start my next thread about 2 stitches in on the end of that wiggle stipple line, and then drop my needle back down, and I'm just using the hand wheel for that, and then put my hands back down on the quilt and carefully start stitching, trying to stay right on that line for those last 2 stitches, and then start a nice curve. And you can see, that's a good way. Get started slowly and then speed up to your normal speed, so that way you maintain that nice wiggly stippling look. One more challenging area that you have to deal with a real quilt is the edges. And for this particular quilt, I didn't plan ahead, and so I really wanted to use the full border. I've been advising you a lot to mark an inch inside of the edge of the border and quilt up to that marked line. Well, for this particular quilt, I really wanted to be able to quilt right up to the edges and then trim it down after it was done. So because of that, you have to be really careful, kind of stretching almost that border. You can see the location of my hands. I'm spreading out that fabric that right there on the edge of the quilt and trying to quilt right up to it. I quilt right in. Sometimes I quilt even over the line. And that really helps. I find stitching over the edge of the quilt top onto the batting and the backing fabric is oftentimes very helpful for locking that top fabric in place. A lot of times it wants to shift, it wants to start to ripple and pleat on you, and the best thing to do is just give it some tension with your hands. Here you can see I'm spreading it out and really kind of mushing it down as I stitch into this corner. Corners are especially challenging, and you have 4 of them on any particular quilt. So you really have to just kind of get in there and spread it out with your hands. Notice how close my hands get to the needle here. I'm spreading it out with my fingertips so that way I can wiggle in there and then wiggle inside the center area of that border, just trying to keep the stitching big, keep the stippling wide, but maintain control over what that top fabric is doing at any given time. It is a challenge, but it's one of those things where as long as you're just spreading it out and smoothing the quilt down at all times, you're going to be fine. This is one of the reasons why I don't go around the whole edge of the quilt and stitch it down, because I often find that things shift and you can easily have ripples and pleats in your quilt if you do some stay stitching or anything like that before you actually get to this area. I prefer to do it this way, where I'm just taking my time, working slowly and spreading out the quilt as I stitch down. You can see here I'm going to work my way down and then actually smooth out this area with my hands, just making sure all that extra baggy fabric is smoothed out to the edge. And that's the one nice thing when your edges are unlocked, when you haven't stitched through them, they're able to spread out more evenly and easily, and you can just smooth it out over that batting and backing. See right there, I just smooth out all that extra fabric and work my way down. It's much easier when you leave it open like that. You maintain more control, But as I said before, just make sure to keep it smooth and keep that fabric kind of tight as you stitch through your borders and finish up your quilt. So that's it for this week. I really hope that this has helped you see how to quilt some real quilts that you might have as UFOs in your sewing room. This UFO has actually been in progress for 4 years. I pieced this quilt up with lots of scrap fabric my mother-in-law gave me, and I'm so happy to finally pull it out and get it quilted so I can give it to her for her birthday this year. It feels wonderful to have finished this project after it's sitting on the shelf for 4 years, and I'm glad that it's finally going to get to where it needs to be. It's going to find a home, right? It was amazingly short amount of time to quilt it. It was only about 3 hours, but it was pretty intense. It was a lot of work to move the quilt, to shift it, and I found many times in the process that I could not really shift the quilt to get a comfortable motion with the machine. It was better to leave it more out of the machine and in an uncomfortable position than it was to shift it and maybe get more quilt to resist how I was moving it. So it was that balance of, okay, well, I might not be always able to see where I'm going, but at least the quilt is easier to move. I hope that makes sense. Basically, it's a good idea to quilt some real quilts so you get some practice with it and so you understand the challenges that happen. The truth of the matter is that quilting on a smaller scale on a home sewing machine is actually easier than quilting on a bigger scale. I know that sounds a little funny, but it certainly is a lot easier because you're moving less of the quilt. When you quilt on a big scale, you need to be moving a lot more of the quilt at any particular time, so there's going to be a lot more challenges with that. As always, don't worry about perfection. I had some blips and boo-boos on this quilt myself, but you know, it's one of those things that once it's all finished, once I wash it, I really can't find any of those mistakes when I stand back and look at it. And my mother-in-law, who's going to get this quilt, is certainly not going to sit there and go, wow, that was a mistake, you know, I don't want this quilt. She's not going to notice, and she certainly won't mind even if she does see a mistake or two on the surface. So I really hope that you will give this a try and maybe consider quilting one of your UFOs and taking it from a UFO into a real quilt. Finally, make sure to link up your blog post from last week. Last week we worked on connecting quilted pieces together using binding strips. Make sure to link up your blog post below this one so that way we can see what you did and how you played with that on your machine. Until next time, let's go quilt! In this video, I used pin moors to lock my pins in place to baste the quilt, and Machineger's quilting gloves to help move the quilt easily under the machine. Find both tools for free motion quilting at daystyledesigns.com.